If you walk out that door, you'll destroy me. Those were the words Ethan Blackwood said the moment I placed the divorce papers on his desk. And if anyone had told me a year earlier that the most powerful billionaire in New York would look at me like that, I would have laughed and walked away. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of silver lights and shadows. The city stretched for miles beneath us, glittering like it belonged to him. Maybe it did. Ethan owned buildings I could see from that window. Companies, investments, entire industries. But none of that seemed to matter as he stared at the papers between us. His hand rested on the polished black desk. Perfectly still. Too still. I had spent 12 months learning his tells. The tighter his control appeared, the closer he was to losing it. "Claire," he said quietly. "Just my name. Nothing more." The sound of it almost made me forget why I was there. Almost. I tightened my grip on the strap of my purse and forced myself to keep breathing. The penthouse suddenly felt smaller than it ever had before. The same penthouse that reporters loved photographing. The same penthouse featured in business magazines. The same place that had once felt like another planet to a woman who spent most of her life counting every dollar before buying groceries. "You don't have to do this," he said. I looked at him carefully. Ethan Blackwood never begged. He negotiated. He persuaded. He won. Yet there was something different in his eyes now. Something unguarded. Something human. And somehow that made this harder. "I do," I answered. This was always supposed to end. The words landed between us like stones. His jaw tightened. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the Hudson River. The silence that followed felt endless. I remembered the first day I met him. The headlines. The cameras. The impossible proposal that had changed everything. Back then, our marriage had been nothing more than a business arrangement. A solution to a problem worth billions of dollars. At least that's what I believed. Maybe that's what he believed too. But somewhere between the public appearances and the private conversations neither of us expected to have, the lines had blurred. Somewhere along the way, pretending became dangerous. I looked down at the signed documents lying on his desk. My signature sat neatly at the bottom of every page. His space remained blank. One signature away from freedom. One signature away from ending the strangest year of my life. Ethan stood slowly. The city lights reflected across his dark suit. For a moment, he looked exactly like the man the world thought they knew. Untouchable. Brilliant. Unshakable. Then he looked directly at me, and that illusion disappeared. "If I sign these," he said softly, "you'll never come back." It wasn't a question. It was fear. Real fear. The kind money couldn't solve. My heart twisted painfully. Because for the first time since I'd known him, Ethan Blackwood wasn't afraid of losing a company. He wasn't afraid of losing his reputation. He was afraid of losing me. And the worst part was that 6 months earlier, none of this was supposed to happen. 6 months earlier, my alarm went off at 5:30 in the morning, long before the sun climbed over the rooftops of Brooklyn. I reached across the nightstand, silenced it, and stared at the cracked ceiling above my bed. The radiator clicked and hummed beside the window. Outside, a garbage truck rattled down the street while someone argued with a car that refused to start. It was the same soundtrack I had woken up to for years. Familiar. Ordinary. Safe. I pulled myself out of bed, wrapped a sweater around my shoulders, and walked into the tiny kitchen of my apartment. The coffee maker sputtered to life while I checked the balance in my bank account on my phone. Rent was due in 4 days. My car insurance payment was due in 6. My teacher's salary covered most things if I was careful. Most things. I sighed and took a sip of coffee that was far too hot. By 7 o'clock, I was standing in front of 23rd graders at P.S. 118, helping them build paper bridges for a science project. Their laughter filled the classroom. Glue sticks rolled across desks. Construction paper covered every available surface. It was chaotic and loud and imperfect. I loved every second of it. "Miss Bennett, mine keeps falling over," one student complained. "That is because engineering requires patience," I told him with a smile. "And possibly less glue." The room erupted into giggles. Moments like that made everything worth it. At least most days. During lunch break, I sat alone in the teacher's lounge grading math quizzes when the television mounted in the corner suddenly grew louder. Someone had switched the channel to a financial news network. I barely paid attention at first. Business news had nothing to do with me. Then I heard a familiar name. Ethan Blackwood. Every screen in the room showed the same image. A tall man in a dark suit walking through a crowd of reporters. Camera flashes exploded around him like lightning. His expression never changed. Calm, controlled, untouchable. The headline beneath his face caught everyone's attention. Blackwood Industries under pressure after public scandal. Teachers stopped talking. Even I looked up. The news anchor continued explaining how investors were growing nervous. Board members were demanding answers. Analysts questioned whether the company's public image could survive another month of negative headlines. Billions of dollars hung in the balance. I stared at the screen for a moment before returning to my stack of papers. Men like Ethan Blackwood belonged to a different universe. His world was private jets and boardrooms. Mine was spelling tests and cafeteria lunches. Whatever crisis he faced had absolutely nothing to do with me. At least that was what I thought. At 4 o'clock, I left school carrying a canvas bag full of student assignments. The spring air felt cool against my skin. Children played basketball in a nearby park. A street musician performed beside the subway entrance. Life moved exactly the way it always had. Ordinary. Predictable. I had no idea that somewhere across Manhattan, powerful people were discussing a solution to $1 billion problem. I had no idea that my name would soon enter conversations happening inside glass conference rooms overlooking the city. And I definitely had no idea that the man on that television screen was about to change my life forever. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon tucked between utility bills and advertisements I usually threw away without reading. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and addressed to me by name in elegant lettering. I turned it over twice before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation to a charity gala hosted by the Blackwood Foundation. I almost laughed. Events like that belonged to people who owned designer gowns and knew which fork to use at expensive dinners. Not elementary school teachers from Brooklyn. I was about to throw it away when a second card slipped onto the kitchen counter. Special guest recognition for outstanding community educators. Apparently one of my students' parents had nominated me months earlier. I stared at the card while my coffee grew cold beside me. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing beneath crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my apartment building. The ballroom glowed with gold light. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying silver trays. Every conversation sounded important. Every person looked wealthy. I tugged nervously at the sleeve of the navy blue dress I had borrowed from my friend Megan. It was beautiful but unfamiliar, like I was wearing someone else's life. Relax, Megan had told me before I left. You teach children. You survive third graders every day? Rich people are easy. Standing there, I was not convinced. I was studying the seating chart when the room suddenly shifted. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. People began watching the entrance. I followed their gaze and immediately knew why. Ethan Blackwood had arrived. Photographs had never captured his presence accurately. He moved through the room with effortless confidence, surrounded by executives, investors, and reporters. Dark suit. Calm expression. Not a single wasted movement. He looked exactly like the kind of man who controlled entire industries before breakfast. I expected him to disappear into the crowd. Instead, something unexpected happened. His eyes found mine. Just for a second. Then another. The moment stretched strangely long before someone interrupted him and the connection broke. I looked away first. My heart beat faster than it should have. 30 minutes later, I was standing near a display of student artwork from local schools when a voice spoke beside me. Claire Bennett. I nearly dropped my glass of sparkling water. Ethan Blackwood stood there. Up close, he seemed even more intimidating. Not because he was rude. Quite the opposite. Because he paid complete attention. The kind that made you feel like everyone else had disappeared. You know my name? I asked. One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. You were the guest speaker tonight. The teacher whose students raised money for 3 school libraries. I blinked. Of all the things I expected him to know, that was not one of them. That is surprisingly specific. I try to pay attention to impressive people. The answer caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, his expression became more serious. Would you have dinner with me tomorrow evening? The question landed so suddenly I thought I had misunderstood him. Excuse me. Dinner. His voice remained calm. There is something important I would like to discuss. Every instinct told me to say no. Men like Ethan Blackwood did not ask women like me to dinner. Whatever this was, it was not ordinary. Looking back now, I should have walked away. Instead, I heard myself say something that changed everything. Fine. One dinner. That is all. The restaurant overlooked the East River, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting thousands of city lights across the water. I arrived 10 minutes early and immediately regretted agreeing to this dinner. Every table seemed occupied by people who belonged there. Men discussing investments. Women dressed with effortless elegance. I felt painfully aware of my simple black dress and the fact that I had checked my bank account that morning before buying gas. The hostess guided me to a private corner table. A single candle flickered between two place settings. I considered leaving. Then Ethan arrived. He moved through the dining room with the same quiet confidence I remembered from the gala. Conversations softened as he passed. Not because he demanded attention, because attention followed him naturally. "Thank you for coming," he said as he pulled out my chair. "I am still not entirely sure why I am here," I admitted. A faint smile touched his face. "That makes two of us." The comment surprised me enough to laugh. For a moment, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a normal man. The dinner started innocently enough. We talked about teaching, my students, his foundation, books, travel. The conversation flowed far more easily than I expected. Ethan listened carefully, asking questions no one usually asked. Not polite questions, real ones, the kind that required actual attention. 2 hours passed before I noticed. Then his expression shifted. Subtle, serious. The atmosphere around the table changed. My stomach tightened. Whatever this dinner was really about had finally arrived. Ethan folded his hands together. "Claire, I need to ask you something unusual." Every warning bell in my head immediately started ringing. That sounds dangerous. Possibly. I waited. Outside the window, a ferry crossed the dark river. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city. Ethan looked directly at me. "I want you to marry me." For several seconds, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. "What?" He remained perfectly calm. "I want you to marry me." My heart nearly stopped. "You cannot possibly be serious." "I am completely serious." I stared at him. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Ethan Blackwood waited patiently until my laughter disappeared. "This is a joke, right?" "No. We have spoken twice. 3 times. That is not helping your argument." To my astonishment, he almost smiled again. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the table. The sight of it instantly erased any remaining amusement. "What is that?" I asked. "A proposal." I did not touch it. "Ethan, what exactly is happening?" For the first time all evening, something heavy appeared behind his eyes. Exhaustion, pressure, maybe even frustration. "My company is facing challenges," he said carefully. "The board wants stability. Investors want reassurance. Public perception matters more than reality. Right now they believe I lack both." The pieces slowly started coming together. "You need a wife. I need a partner the public can believe in." My chest tightened. Suddenly the expensive restaurant felt colder. "And you think that partner is me?" "Yes." I looked at the folder sitting untouched between us. Then back at him. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. Everything felt unreal. Finally I stood up. "No." Ethan blinked once. "No. Absolutely not." I grabbed my purse. "Good night, Mr. Blackwood." And for the first time that evening, Ethan Blackwood looked genuinely caught off guard. The next morning, I convinced myself the entire dinner had been a strange misunderstanding. Billionaires did not propose contract marriages to elementary school teachers. That kind of thing happened in movies, not real life. By lunchtime, I had almost succeeded in forgetting about it. Then my phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, it rang again. Then again. By the 4th call, several teachers were staring at me. "You should probably answer that," my friend Rachel said. "Whoever it is seems determined." I stepped into the hallway and reluctantly pressed the green button. "What?" I asked. "Good afternoon to you too," Ethan replied. His voice sounded annoyingly calm. "I am at your school." I froze. "You are where?" "Across the street." I moved to the nearest window and nearly dropped my phone. A black town car sat beside the curb. Ethan leaned casually against it wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Parents walking past kept glancing in his direction. "You cannot be serious. I am beginning to notice you say that a lot." I closed my eyes. "Go away." 5 minutes. "No." 3 minutes. "Ethan." 1 minute. Somehow he sounded amused. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him at a small coffee shop around the corner from the school. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Ethan slid the same folder across the table. I did not touch it. I already said no. I know. Then why are we here? For the first time, he looked genuinely serious. Because I think you deserve all the information before making your final decision. I hated that part of me was curious. Fine. Talk. He explained everything. The investors. The board. The headlines. The pressure building around his company. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every detail sounded carefully calculated. By the end, I understood exactly why he needed help. That did not mean I intended to give it. Still no, I said firmly. Ethan nodded slowly. Understood. Relief washed through me. Then my phone buzzed. One message. Then another. Then 3 more. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach drop. The landlord. The property management office. A final notice regarding the apartment building where my mother lived. I read the messages twice before the meaning fully settled in. The building had been sold. Tenants were being forced to leave within 60 days. My mother had nowhere else to go. Ethan watched my expression carefully. What happened? I hesitated. Then I told him. The words tasted bitter. I hated discussing personal problems, especially with him. When I finished, silence settled between us. Ethan looked down at the table for several seconds. Then he reached into the folder and removed a single page. If you ever reconsider, he said quietly, sliding it toward me. There are conditions. I glanced at the paper despite myself. 1 year. Separate bedrooms. Complete freedom to continue teaching. Financial independence protected by contract. The arrangement would end automatically after 12 months. 3 simple rules sat at the top of the page. No love. No interference in private lives. No extension beyond 1 year. I stared at the words longer than I should have. Then I folded the paper and slipped it into my purse. And for the first time, saying no longer felt quite as easy. The paper stayed in my purse for 8 days. 8 days of teaching multiplication tables, grading homework, and pretending my life had not quietly split into 2 possible futures. In one future, I continued exactly as I was. In the other, I married a man whose face appeared on television more often than some politicians. Every night, I told myself the answer was obvious. Every morning, I found myself thinking about the contract again. The final notice on my mother's apartment building did not help. Neither did the stack of brochures for retirement communities she could not afford. One rainy Tuesday evening, I sat at her kitchen table while she stirred a pot of soup and pretended not to worry. I will figure something out, she said. You always do, I replied. But neither of us sounded convinced. The drive home felt longer than usual. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. My windshield wipers moved back and forth in a steady rhythm. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew I was tired of pretending I did not have a decision to make. I pulled the folded contract from my purse and read every word again. 1 year. Separate lives. Complete freedom to continue teaching. Financial protection for both parties. Automatic termination after 12 months. The language was surprisingly respectful. Clinical. Precise. Almost cold. Yet there was one sentence near the end that caught my attention. Claire Bennett shall maintain full independence regarding career, family relationships, and personal decisions throughout the duration of the agreement. I read it 3 times. Then I called him. Ethan answered before the first ring finished. Hello, Claire. I frowned. How did you know it was me? Hope. The answer caught me off guard. For a second, neither of us spoke. Can we meet? I finally asked. Of course. The next evening, we sat in a quiet conference room overlooking Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline. The city glowed beneath us. Ethan stood beside the glass when I arrived. He looked tired. Not physically. Something deeper. Like a man carrying too much responsibility for too long. You came, he said softly. Do not sound so surprised. I have learned not to make assumptions where you are concerned. I sat down and placed the contract on the table. I have conditions. Something almost resembling relief crossed his face. He took a seat across from me. I am listening. For the next hour we negotiated. Not money. Not luxury. Boundaries. My mother. My career. My privacy. My students. Every concern I raised, he addressed seriously. No arguments. No pressure. No manipulation. When I finished, silence settled between us. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. Ethan folded his hands together. Anything else? I looked directly at him. One more thing. What is it? My heart beat faster. If either of us starts treating this like something other than an agreement, we walk away. His expression became unreadable. For several seconds, he simply watched me. Then he nodded once. Agreed. I picked up the pen sitting beside the contract. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. Somewhere below, millions of people moved through their ordinary lives. None of them knew that one signature was about to change mine forever. The wedding happened 3 weeks later on a bright Saturday morning that felt far too beautiful for something that was supposed to be temporary. News vans lined the street outside the historic Manhattan venue. Reporters crowded behind barriers. Cameras flashed so constantly that the light seemed to pulse across the building. I sat in a quiet room overlooking the garden and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The dress was elegant, simple, nothing like the extravagant designs magazines would have expected for an event involving Ethan Blackwood. That had been my choice. One of the few things I refused to compromise on. A soft knock sounded at the door. My mother stepped inside. Her eyes immediately filled with emotion. "You look beautiful," she whispered. I laughed nervously. I looked terrified. "That too." She squeezed my hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she surprised me. "Do you trust him?" The question settled heavily between us. I thought about the contract, the negotiations, the weeks of preparation, the dozens of conversations that never appeared in public. "I think so," I admitted. "That is more important than love right now." Before I could respond, another knock interrupted us. The wedding coordinator announced it was time. My heart immediately began racing. The walk toward the ceremony felt strangely unreal. Music drifted through the hall. Guests stood as I entered. Investors, politicians, business leaders, people whose names appeared on television. Yet I barely noticed any of them. My attention locked onto Ethan waiting at the front. He stood perfectly still in a dark suit. Calm as always, controlled as always. But when our eyes met, something shifted in his expression. Something softer. Something I could not quite identify. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Vows, signatures, applause, camera flashes. Then suddenly it was done. Legally, officially. Ethan Blackwood was my husband. The realization felt impossible. Hours later, we stood together before a crowd of reporters during the reception. Questions flew in every direction. How did you meet? When did you fall in love? What is next for the happy couple? Every answer had been carefully prepared in advance. Every smile practiced. Every appearance calculated. At least that was the plan. Then one reporter asked a question no one expected. "Mr. Blackwood, what was the first thing that attracted you to your wife?" The room fell silent. I expected a polished answer. Something safe. Something designed for headlines. Ethan looked at me for a moment. Longer than necessary. Then he said quietly, "She treats people like they matter." The crowd smiled. Cameras flashed. The moment passed. But something about his answer stayed with me. Later that evening, after the guests departed and the interviews ended, we finally arrived at the penthouse. The city glowed beyond the enormous windows. Silence filled the rooms. For the first time all day, there were no cameras. No reporters. No audience. Just the two of us. Ethan loosened his tie and looked around the empty living room. "Well," he said, "we survived day one." I smiled despite myself. Then my eyes landed on a framed photograph already sitting on a nearby table. A wedding portrait taken only hours earlier. We looked surprisingly convincing. And for the first time since signing the contract, that realization made me a little nervous. The first few weeks of marriage felt less like a relationship and more like two strangers learning how to share the same orbit. The penthouse was enormous, larger than some hotels I had visited. Entire sections remained untouched for days at a time. Ethan left before sunrise most mornings and often returned long after dark. We crossed paths over breakfast occasionally, exchanging polite conversations that sounded more like meetings than personal interactions. It should have been easy. That was the point of the agreement. No expectations, no complications, no emotions. Yet something unexpected began happening. The more time I spent around Ethan, the less he resembled the man from magazine covers. One Thursday evening I woke just after midnight. The city lights glowed faintly through my bedroom windows. For a moment, I thought a storm had awakened me. Then I realized I heard movement somewhere in the apartment. Curious, I stepped into the hallway. The penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. A narrow strip of light spilled from beneath the door of Ethan's office. I hesitated before walking closer. Through the partially open door, I saw him sitting alone at his desk. The room was dark except for a single lamp. Papers covered every surface. Financial reports, contracts, presentations. His jacket rested over a chair. His tie was gone. For the first time since meeting him, he looked exhausted. Not billionaire exhausted. Human exhausted. The kind that settles deep into a person's shoulders after carrying too much for too long. He rubbed his eyes and stared at a computer screen without moving. Something about the image stopped me. This was not the confident executive reporters photographed. This was a man sitting alone at 1 a.m. while the rest of the city slept. I quietly returned to the kitchen and made coffee. 10 minutes later, I stood in the doorway holding a mug. Ethan looked up, surprised. "You are awake." "Apparently so are you." I placed the coffee beside him. He stared at it, then at me. "You made this?" "Do not sound so shocked." A faint smile appeared. Small, brief, real. He accepted the mug. "Thank you." I glanced at the mountain of documents surrounding him. "Do you ever stop working?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked down at the papers before answering. "Not usually." "That sounds miserable." To my surprise, he laughed softly. It was the first time I had ever heard it. The sound changed his entire face. For a moment, he looked younger, less guarded, more approachable. Most people do not say things like that to me. Most people are probably impressed by private jets. And you are not. I teach third graders, Ethan. Last week, one of my students proudly showed me a frog he found in a puddle. That was the highlight of his month. Another smile appeared. This one lingered longer. The conversation lasted only 15 minutes before I returned to bed. Nothing important happened. No dramatic revelations. No life-changing moment. Yet as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I kept thinking about the tired man sitting alone in that office. And for the first time since signing the contract, I found myself wondering what Ethan Blackwood looked like when nobody in the world was watching. Autumn arrived quietly. The trees outside my classroom shifted from green to gold while the rhythm of our unusual marriage settled into something almost comfortable. Mornings began with coffee in the kitchen. Evenings sometimes ended with brief conversations in the living room while the city sparkled beyond the windows. Neither of us mentioned how different things felt compared to the beginning. We did not need to. The changes appeared in small moments. Ethan started asking about my students by name. I started recognizing when he was carrying too much stress before he said a single word. One Friday afternoon, I was helping my class prepare decorations for the annual school fundraiser when the principal appeared at my classroom door looking nervous. "Claire, there is someone here to see you." I assumed it was a parent. Instead, I stepped into the hallway and found Ethan standing beside the trophy case. Several teachers had clearly noticed him. A few students were openly staring. "What are you doing here?" I asked. Ethan glanced around the hallway, apparently causing a disturbance. I laughed despite myself. "You cannot just appear at an elementary school in the middle of the day." "I brought something." He handed me a folder. Inside was a proposal from the Blackwood Foundation. Funding for new library equipment, updated classroom technology, arts programs, reading initiatives. I stared at the numbers in disbelief. "Ethan, the school submitted an application 6 months ago. You approved it." He shrugged lightly. The proposal was excellent. I looked up at him. "You read the proposal?" "Every page." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Not because of the money, because he had paid attention. The same way he always seemed to pay attention when it mattered. That evening, the school hosted a small celebration for donors and volunteers. Parents filled the gymnasium. Children performed songs slightly off-key. Folding chairs squeaked across the floor. It was imperfect and wonderful. Ethan attended the entire event. He listened to student presentations, spoke with teachers, sat through 30 minutes of elementary choir performances without checking his phone once. More than once I caught people looking surprised. Honestly, so was I. Near the end of the evening, one of my students tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Are you Miss Bennett's husband?" Ethan smiled. "I am." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "She talks about helping people all the time." Ethan glanced toward me across the room. Something unreadable flickered through his expression. "She is very good at that." Later, as we drove home through the glowing streets of Manhattan, silence filled the car. Comfortable silence. Dangerous silence. The kind that allowed thoughts to grow. I watched reflections of city lights slide across the window. My heart felt strangely full. Across from me, Ethan loosened his tie and stared out at the traffic ahead. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "Today was my favorite day in months." I turned toward him. The honesty in his voice caught me completely off guard. Ethan immediately looked away, almost as though he regretted saying it. But the damage was already done. Because somewhere between the school fundraiser and the drive home, I realized something unsettling. The agreement had not changed. The rules had not changed. Yet the way I felt whenever Ethan entered a room absolutely had. Winter arrived with sharp winds and early sunsets. The city outside the penthouse looked different after dark, wrapped in silver light and reflections that stretched across the river. By December, our faces appeared regularly in magazines and business publications. Analysts praised Ethan's stability. Investors seemed satisfied. The arrangement was working exactly as intended. At least that was what everyone believed. One evening, I returned home earlier than usual after a faculty meeting was canceled. The penthouse was quiet. A light glowed beneath the door of Ethan's study. I considered saying hello before heading to my room. Then I noticed the door was slightly open. Inside, no one was there. A stack of folders sat across the desk beside a laptop screen displaying financial reports. I was about to leave when a familiar word caught my eye. My name. Curiosity stopped me. I should have walked away. Instead, I glanced down. The folder contained internal communications from months earlier, board discussions, public relations assessments, strategic recommendations. At first, none of it seemed important. Then I found the document. A presentation prepared before Ethan and I had ever met. Across the top, a title read, Reputation Recovery Initiative. My stomach tightened. I kept reading. Investor confidence projections, media response forecasts, public approval estimates. Then a section labeled recommended actions. Marriage appeared at the top of the list. A carefully selected spouse. Positive public image. Increased trust. Improved market confidence. Every statistic was neatly organized. Every outcome predicted. My hands started shaking. I turned another page. There was a timeline. The gala. The foundation event. Potential candidates. Selection criteria. And there, attached to the final page, was a profile. My profile. Claire Bennett. Elementary school teacher. Community involvement. Positive public perception. Ideal candidate. For a moment, I could not breathe. The room blurred around me. The conversations. The dinners. The promises. The wedding. Every memory collided painfully inside my chest. I heard the front door open somewhere in the apartment. Ethan's voice echoed faintly through the hallway. I quickly closed the folder and stepped back from the desk. My heart hammered so loudly I could barely think. Minutes later, he found me standing beside the windows overlooking the city. Snow drifted softly beyond the glass. "You are home early," he said. Then he stopped. Immediately. Because he saw my face. "Claire." His voice changed. "What happened?" I looked at him for several seconds before speaking. "How long?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Confusion crossed his expression. Then realization followed. His eyes shifted toward the study, toward the open door. The silence that followed told me everything. "Claire, let me explain." I laughed once. The sound felt hollow. "Explain what?" My voice cracked. That I was a strategy? A solution? A public relations project? It was not like that. Then tell me why my name was sitting inside a file before we ever met. Ethan opened his mouth. No words came out. And somehow that hurt more than anything he could have said. Because for the first time since our wedding, I looked at the man standing in front of me and honestly did not know whether the best moments of my life had been real at all. The next morning, the penthouse felt unfamiliar. The same marble floors. The same city view. The same winter sunlight spilling through the windows. Yet everything had changed. I packed 2 suitcases in silence while snow drifted beyond the glass. Every item I folded felt heavier than it should have. Memories hid everywhere. The coffee mugs in the kitchen. The books on the shelves. The blanket folded over the living room sofa where we had spent countless evenings talking about nothing important and somehow everything important. Ethan had not slept. I knew because I had not slept either. Around 6 in the morning, I found him standing alone beside the windows. His tie was gone. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. The city reflected in the dark circles beneath his eyes. He turned when he heard my footsteps. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You are leaving." It was not a question. I nodded. The silence that followed stretched painfully long. Finally, Ethan took a slow breath. "Claire, what you found was real. The board created that plan before I met you. I looked away. That does not help. I know. His honesty almost made it worse. The proposal existed. The strategy existed. But everything after that changed. I closed my suitcase. How would I know the difference? He did not answer immediately. Outside, a ferry moved across the gray river. Somewhere below, traffic crawled through Manhattan. Life continued as if nothing had happened. Because I changed, he said quietly. You changed me. The words landed somewhere deep inside my chest. Dangerous words. The kind I had spent months trying not to hear. I wanted to believe him. That was the problem. I wanted to believe every word. But trust once cracked never breaks cleanly. It splinters. I cannot do this right now, I whispered. Ethan looked down for a moment before nodding. Slowly, reluctantly, like a man accepting something he could not control. An hour later, a car waited downstairs. The driver loaded my luggage into the trunk while snowflakes drifted through the cold air. I turned back once before entering the vehicle. Ethan stood near the entrance of the building, hands in his coat pockets, completely still, watching. He looked less like the most powerful businessman in the city and more like someone who had just lost something important. The drive to Brooklyn felt longer than it ever had before. My apartment seemed smaller after months in the penthouse. Quieter too. Yet instead of relief, an unexpected emptiness settled around me. Days passed, then weeks. I returned to teaching, graded homework, attended staff meetings, smiled when people expected me to smile. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. But something was missing. Every morning the news reported another success for Blackwood Industries. Stock prices climbed. Investors celebrated. Business magazines praised Ethan's leadership. By every measurable standard, he had won. Yet late one evening, while scrolling through an online article, I noticed a photograph taken during a recent interview. Hundreds of people probably saw a confident billionaire. I saw something different. Exhaustion, loneliness, regret. I stared at the image longer than I should have. Then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. 3 simple words. Not from Ethan. From his assistant. Mr. Blackwood collapsed during a board meeting. He is physically fine, but he has barely left his office in 2 weeks. My heart stopped. Because for the first time since leaving, I realized I was not the only one struggling to breathe without the life we had built together. The message stayed on my phone for 3 days before I finally did something about it. 3 days of trying to focus on lesson plans while Ethan's face kept appearing in my thoughts. 3 days of telling myself his health was none of my business anymore. 3 days of failing to believe it. On the 4th day, snow covered the city in a soft layer of white. My students left for winter break carrying handmade ornaments and construction paper snowflakes. The classroom felt strangely empty after they were gone. I sat alone at my desk staring out the window when my phone vibrated again. This time the message came directly from Ethan. There were only 4 words. I miss my friend. Nothing else. No pressure. No explanations. No demands. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that had become impossible to ignore. That evening I found myself standing outside Blackwood Industries headquarters. The building rose into the gray winter sky like a monument to ambition. For several minutes I remained on the sidewalk debating whether to leave. Then I walked inside. The receptionist recognized me immediately. 10 minutes later I stood outside Ethan's office. The door was partially open. Through the glass walls I saw him sitting alone at the conference table. No executives. No assistants. No reporters. Just Ethan. He looked thinner. Tired. The confidence was still there, but something essential seemed missing. He looked up when I entered. For a second, he simply stared at me, like he thought I might disappear if he blinked. Then he slowly stood. Claire. My name sounded almost fragile coming from him. I folded my arms tightly. Your assistant needs to stop sending me dramatic updates. A small laugh escaped him, the first genuine laugh I had heard in weeks. I will speak with her. Silence settled between us. Familiar. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Finally, Ethan took a slow breath. I was going to come find you again. I know. Every day. I looked down at the floor. My heart felt impossibly heavy. Why didn't you? His answer came immediately. Because you asked for space. And for once in my life, I wanted to respect something more than what I wanted. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked up. Ethan was watching me with complete honesty. No strategy. No calculations. No boardroom negotiations. Just truth. The plan was real, he said quietly. I will regret that for the rest of my life. But Claire, The woman I chose to marry is not the woman I fell in love with. Because I did not know her yet. My breath caught. Ethan stepped closer. Not enough to pressure me. Just enough that I could see the sincerity in his eyes. I fell in love with the teacher who stayed after school to help struggling students. The daughter who worried more about her mother than herself. The woman who brought me coffee when she thought nobody was watching. You became the most important part of my life long after the contract was signed. The room felt very still. Outside the windows, snow drifted between skyscrapers. New York moved around us while time seemed to stop. And for the first time since I left, I realized Ethan was no longer trying to save his company. He was trying to save us. 3 months later, the first warm days of spring arrived in New York. The snow disappeared from the sidewalks. Trees along the streets began showing hints of green. Life moved forward, quietly and steadily, and somehow Ethan and I moved forward with it. We did not rush back into old routines. We rebuilt everything one honest conversation at a time. There were no contracts between us anymore. No public strategies. No carefully planned appearances. Just two people learning how to trust again. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan asked me to meet him at a small botanical garden on the edge of the city. The request seemed unusual enough that curiosity won immediately. When I arrived, sunlight filtered through flowering trees. The air smelled faintly of roses and fresh grass. Families wandered along stone pathways. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. It felt nothing like the extravagant places Ethan normally visited. That alone made me smile. I followed the path until I reached a quiet clearing. Then I stopped. My breath caught instantly. Several dozen people stood beneath strings of white lights. My mother, my closest friends, teachers from my school, even a few former students and their families. Everyone smiled as I approached. And standing at the center of it all was Ethan. No reporters, no cameras, no investors, no executives. Just Ethan. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sunlight danced across the leaves above us while the world seemed to fade away. Then he took a slow step forward. You once told me that the most important things in life cannot be negotiated, he said. Emotion tightened my throat immediately. I remember. He smiled softly. At the time, I did not understand what you meant. A few people laughed quietly. Ethan looked around at the gathering before returning his attention to me. I spent most of my life believing success could solve every problem. Then you walked into my life and taught me that respect matters more than power. That kindness matters more than image. And that love cannot be managed like a business plan. My eyes filled with tears. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. The crowd collectively held its breath. The first time I asked you to marry me, I offered a contract. His voice softened. Today I have nothing to offer except myself. He opened the box. A simple ring rested inside. Elegant. Timeless. Real. Claire Bennett, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Will you marry me again? The tears escaped before I could stop them. I laughed through them anyway. You are aware we are technically still married. The crowd laughed. Ethan laughed too. Then his expression turned serious once more. Then let me ask properly this time. My heart felt too full for words. Every difficult moment, every mistake, every lesson, every second that brought us here seemed to exist all at once. Finally I nodded. Yes. The applause erupted around us. Ethan slipped the ring onto my finger and pulled me into a gentle embrace while cheers echoed through the garden. Later that evening, surrounded by the people we loved most, we celebrated not the marriage that had begun with a contract, but the one that had survived long enough to become real. And as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, I realized something simple. Ethan Blackwood may have entered my life searching for a solution, but somewhere along the way, we found something neither of us had expected. A home in each other.